Welcome to the second annual Religion Soup. My name is Greg Manette, and I am the director and moderator of this event, and I work in chaplaincy with the navigators at St. Mary's University, and I'm also a proud graduate of this fine institution here, Acadia Divinity College. I did my Master of Divinity and my Master of Arts, and this place holds a very special location in this heart of mine. So let me make a special welcome to you, but I want to make one particular special welcome to the students here from Kingswood University who drove down here from New Brunswick with their professor, Dr. Gavel, and we're very pleased to see you here. Thank you for making the trip down, and I hope you're really going to enjoy this evening. So it's great to see so many of you here to take in this evening's event, and we had such a good time doing it last year that we wanted to make sure that there was no fear of a snowstorm. Thus, we're doing this in October instead of in January. So I want to thank you for coming out to this event. And I trust that you're going to find it very informative and educational. This is the goal of Religion Soup. Regardless of where you stand regarding your views on Jesus of Nazareth, we hope that these events will give you much to consider and to mull over in the coming days, months, and years. It is our hope that Religion Soup will create in you a desire to learn. And if you are not yet on a journey to explore the history behind the founder of Christianity, namely Jesus, that you will begin to study up on the life of arguably the most important and influential human being who has ever lived. I also want to thank Acadia Divinity College for hosting this event tonight. They put a lot of work into this event, and they deserve a lot of credit. We'd also like to say that if you feel inclined to make a donation, that there will be donation bins at the door on the way out that will help cover the costs of this evening. So thank you in advance, whatever you can give. Unlike last January, which was a debate, this evening is different. It's a dialogue. You will find the order for tonight's event in your programs, and we're going to start with opening presentations by both Dr. Lyekouna and Dr. Martin. Then we're going to move into a 25 to 30-minute dialogue where both presenters will engage with each other's thoughts on the topic. Imagine that you are a fly in the wall when these two guests are sitting at a local pub, say the Library Pub down the hill here in Wolfville, and they're bantering back and forth about their views on the evening's topic. That's what we're trying to create here tonight, that sort of atmosphere, although with glasses of water and a few hundred flies on that wall. After this, we're going to take some questions from the audience. And like last January, we're going to ask you to text in your questions. So text them in with your cell phone. If you own a cell phone and you don't quite know how to use it, tap the nearest young person on the shoulder and they'll show you how to use it. But fear not if you don't understand technology too well, because tonight, Dr. Martin will not be using PowerPoint. So please, text in your questions, and some of the hard ones will be answered. We look forward to seeing what you come up with. Religion Soup is an annual dialogue event aimed at fostering discussion around topics relevant to the Christian faith. Tonight we bring together two of the leading scholars in the field of Christian origins to discuss one of the biggest questions relating to Christianity, the deity of Jesus. It is helpful to hear different perspectives in order to be informed and to expand one's own horizon. I can say firsthand after being at the event last night that both of our guests are very intelligent. They are both very good presenters, and we have a lot to learn from both of them. So I'd ask you to try to keep an open mind tonight and to listen to both their arguments. Try to keep an open mind and really listen. You will benefit, I guarantee it. Christianity is an historic faith rooted in ancient Judaism and finds its origins in the community of first-century devotees to Jesus of Nazareth. One of last year's presenters, Professor Craig Evans, who's sitting right here, he accurately stated that Jesus has left a very big wake in history. I agree. Without Jesus, Christianity would not exist and we would not be here in this room tonight. Last year's other participant, Professor Bart Ehrman, recently stated in his book, Did Jesus Exist?, that, quote, there are several points in which virtually all scholars of antiquity agree. Jesus was a Jewish man known to be a preacher and teacher who was crucified in Jerusalem during the reign of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, when Pontius Pilate was the governor of Judea. This is the view of nearly every trained scholar. But one must ask the question, How did Christians come to revere Jesus as the divine Son of God? How did a crucified Jewish man in the first half of the first century manage to spawn the largest religion in the world today, having millions, maybe even billions of people worship him? Tonight, we discuss the question of whether Jesus believed himself to be divine. We are not asking the question, is Jesus divine? But did Jesus believe he was divine? There is a difference. We are very proud to welcome Dr. Michael Lykona and Professor Dale Martin to Wolfville for this evening's Religion Soup Dialogue. I'll give a brief introduction prior to each of the opening presentations. Both of our guests will present for approximately 25 to 30 minutes, beginning with Dr. Michael Lykona. Mike Lykona is Associate Professor in Theology at Houston Baptist University, and he's the president of Risen Jesus Incorporated. Mike was interviewed by Lee Strobel in his book, The Case for the Real Jesus, and has appeared in Strobel's video, The Case for Christ. He's the author of numerous books, including The Resurrection of Jesus, a new historiographical approach, which is for sale on the way out. It's 700 pages long and makes for great reading and something to prop open your door. He has also authored Paul Meets Muhammad. He's the co-author of a popular apologetic book with Gary Habermas called The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, which is an award-winning book. He's also co-edited with William Dembski, Evidence for God, 50 Arguments for Faith from the Bible, History, Philosophy, and Science. Mike is a member of the Evangelical Philosophical Society, the Institute for Biblical Research, and the Society of Biblical Literature. He has spoken on more than 50 university campuses and has appeared on dozens of radio and television programs. His website is risenjesus.com. Dr. Lykona earned his PhD with highest distinction from the University of Pretoria, and his dissertation is that 700-page door slammer out in the lobby as well. So, folks, please welcome Dr. Michael Lykona.
Well, thank you. I'm going to use this. Thank you and good evening. I'd like to thank Acadia Divinity School for hosting this evening's dialogue. I'd also like to thank Dale Martin and Greg Manette for just the last 2 days. They've just been wonderful spending with these guys, and we've had a lot of fun. I also want to just say how great it is to see Professor Craig Evans again. I have known him for several years and look up to the guy. I have the highest respect for him. You guys have a world-class scholar here at Acadia, and I envy you in your ability the opportunities you have to just hang out with this guy. He's amazing. Well, Lyndon B. Johnson was President of the United States from 1963 to 69. And at a time when Secret Service protection wasn't nearly as tight as it is today, President Johnson was speeding down a Texas road in his convertible when a police officer pulled him over. And as the police officer approached his car, he recognized who the driver was and exclaimed, "Oh my God!" To which Lyndon B. Johnson replied, "That's right, son, and don't you forget it." Lyndon Johnson's statement was more of a reflection of his personal arrogance than it was a sincere belief that he was divine. But that's not always been the case. Granting the status of deity to a Roman emperor may have originally been intended to be interpreted only honorifically. However, it seems clear that the Roman emperors Caligula and Nero actually believed themselves to have been gods. This leads us to the question being discussed this evening. Did Jesus of Nazareth believe that he was God in some sense? I think that he did, and I'm going to be making a historical case to that end this evening. Before I launch into that case, I just want to make one preliminary point. As with any historical investigation, the evidence will suggest certain conclusions with varying degrees of certainty. Historians across the board are very certain that Jesus thought he had a unique relationship with God who had chosen him to usher in his kingdom. that Jesus performed deeds that astonished crowds and that both he and his followers regarded as divine miracles and exorcisms, that he taught in parables, that he was crucified on orders of Pontius Pilate and died as a result. The supporting data for these are so strong that they may be regarded as historical bedrock, facts past doubting. But there are other data for which a good amount of support exists, but which are not quite as strong as what I've just mentioned. Did Jesus regard himself as Messiah? Did he predict his imminent death and subsequent resurrection? I would place this evening's question in this category. So accordingly, my conclusion is going to be somewhat modest. Tonight I'm contending that that it's historically more probable than not that Jesus claimed to be God in some sense. Now, with this preliminary issue covered, my thesis statement is as follows. There are two key truths that render it more probable than not that Jesus claimed to be God in some sense. Key truth number one, the earliest known Christian generation, and one that was most plausibly connected to the apostles, regarded Jesus as God in some sense. And I'm going to offer 3 lines of support. Number one, most New Testament scholars agree that we have an early Christian hymn embedded in Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 through 11. This hymn presents what is perhaps the highest Christology in the entire New Testament. It reads, "While existing in the form of God, Jesus did not regard equality with God something to be held on to, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant and being born in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself, becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. For this reason, God exalted him greatly and gave to him the name that's above every name, in order that at Jesus' name every knee may bow, of those in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue may profess that the Lord is Jesus Christ, to the glory of God the Father." There are a few major elements I want to focus on in this text. For one, Paul contrasts being in the form of God with taking the form of a servant. Since being a servant is a role, I understand Paul to be saying that Jesus existed in the role of God. However, he gave up that role, was made in human likeness, and took the role of a servant. Thus, Paul teaches that Jesus was pre-existent and served in the role of God as his equal. This is profound, because Paul is saying much more than that Jesus was God's favored servant. Paul is saying that prior to leaving heaven for earth, Jesus served in the role of God and was God's equal. This is much like we read in the very first verse of John's Gospel. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." So the view of a pre-existent Jesus who was on par with God was not something that evolved as the later Gospels were being written. It was present in Paul's letter to the church in Philippi, probably written before any of the Gospels, and in a hymn that may have been much earlier. A second element in this hymn to observe is that as a result of Jesus' obedience on the cross, God exalted him greatly by giving him the name above all others. Now, if I were to ask you all, what was that name? Most of you would probably say, Jesus. At least that's what I thought. But that can't be what Paul's saying. Because what name did Jesus have before he was exalted? Jesus. So, he really wasn't given that name then. And if that's what it was talking about, then that means everybody throughout history who had the name Jesus, Joshua, or Jesus could say, "I've got the name. Hey, Mom, thanks for the name." No, that's not what's going on. The term for name in Greek also means title. And what's the title that's above any other title you can think of? Prime Minister? President? Emperor? No. The very highest title in the world and beyond is Lord or God. And this is the title given to Jesus, or perhaps even returned to him. A third element to observe in this hymn is the end result of getting that title. And here the hymn borrows from Isaiah chapter 45, where God says, "I am God, the only God. There is no other God but me." After saying this statement and repeating it over and over, he says it a total of 5 times, God, who identifies himself as the Lord, says, "Every knee will bow to me and every tongue profess to God." It is this text that the hymn applies to Jesus. And what will every tongue profess? The title above all others. Jesus Christ is Lord. In other words, Jesus Christ is Yahweh himself. This is astonishing. Paul, an apostle who knew the other apostles, proclaimed that Jesus was pre-existent in the role of God, was equal to God, and that after his crucifixion was given the title above all others. He attributed to Jesus what was meant only for God in Isaiah 45. Every knee bowing and every tongue professing, and they will profess that Jesus is Yahweh. This is the first line of support for my contention that the earliest known Christian generation, and one which was most plausibly connected to the apostles, regarded Jesus as God in some sense. The second line of support comes from Paul's letter to the church in Rome. In chapter 10, verse 9, he writes, "If you profess with your mouth the Lord is Jesus, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved." Paul goes on to say why this is the case, culminating with this statement in verse 13, "For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." This is a precise quotation from Joel chapter 2, verse 32, where the Lord is none other than God, Yahweh. In other words, Paul states that whoever professes that Yahweh is Jesus and sincerely believes that God raised him from the dead will be saved. For whoever calls on the name of Yahweh will be saved. The third line of support comes from the early belief that Jesus would do what the Old Testament attributes to God. Referring to the day of the Lord, Zechariah 14:5 says, "The Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him." In 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 13, Paul writes of the coming of our Lord Jesus with all his holy ones, identifying Jesus as the God of Zechariah 14:5. This is important because 1 Thessalonians is probably the earliest piece of Christian literature in the New Testament and written by an apostle who knew the other apostles. The day of the Lord, where the Lord is God, is mentioned in Joel chapter 1 and chapter 2. When Paul writes 1 Thessalonians and 1 Corinthians, however, the day of the Lord is when Jesus returns. Again, Paul is equating the coming of Jesus with the coming of God in Joel chapters 1 and 2. To summarize, in the earliest traceable times of the Christian church, and one that has links to the apostles, we have an extraordinarily high view of Jesus, one that refers to him as being, in some sense, God, although functionally subordinate to the Father. Jesus was more than an ambassador where one represents another or has authority delegated to him. He served in the role of God and was equal to him prior to coming to earth. Thus, irrespective of how some Christians of that day may have regarded Jesus, as far as we can tell, the belief that Jesus is God in some sense belongs to the apostolic line of tradition, and that's what matters most when attempting to learn what Jesus taught about himself. Richard Bauckham of Cambridge University writes, "Early Judaism had clear and consistent ways of characterizing the unique identity of the one God, and thus distinguishing the one God absolutely from all other reality. When New Testament Christology is read with this Jewish theological context in mind, it becomes clear that from the earliest post-Easter beginnings of Christology onwards, early Christians included Jesus precisely and unambiguously within the unique identity of the one God of Israel." Accordingly, key truth number one seems firmly established. The earliest known Christian generation, and one that was most plausibly connected to the apostles, regarded Jesus as God in some sense. But what on earth led the apostles, who were staunch monotheistic Jews, to regard Jesus as God? I believe the answer lay in key truth number two. The best explanation for this high view of Jesus is that he claimed to be God in some sense. Here we go to the Gospels. Starting in the 1970s, New Testament scholars Charles Talbert of Baylor and David Olney of Notre Dame proposed that the Gospels belong to the genre of Greco-Roman biography. Classicist Richard Burridge took exception with the claim and set out to demonstrate that the Gospels rather belong to a genre of its own. He instead discovered that the Gospels indeed belong to Greco-Roman biography, and his resulting book, What Are the Gospels?, has become the definitive treatment on the subject. And today a growing majority of scholars regard the Gospels as belonging to this genre. The objective of Greco-Roman biography was to reveal the character of the subject through his sayings and deeds. The most commonly cited statement from an ancient biographer named Plutarch is what he said to this effect at the very beginning of his life of Alexander the Great. He writes, "For it is not histories that I am writing, but lives. And in the most illustrious deeds there is not always a manifestation of virtue or vice. Nay, a slight thing like a phrase or a jest often makes a greater revelation of character than battles where thousands fall, or the greatest armaments or sieges of cities. Accordingly, just as painters get the likeness in their portraits from the face and the expression of the eyes, wherein the character shows itself, but make very little account of the other parts of the body, so I must be permitted to devote myself rather to the signs of the soul in men, and by means of these to portray the life of each, leaving to others the description of their great contests." So the primary objective of ancient biography was to reveal the person's character. So how do the Gospels portray the character of Jesus, since they're biographies? Who was Jesus? I want to look first at an enigmatic figure in ancient Jewish literature and the Gospels called the Son of Man. Scholars are virtually unanimous that Son of Man was Jesus' favorite way of referring to himself, but there's no agreement pertaining to what he meant by it. There are typically three meanings behind Son of Man. The first is that Jesus regarded himself as human, similar to saying son of Adam, son of Adam. The second is simply referring to oneself in the third person. Now, those of us who have watched Seinfeld episodes may remember one where Jimmy is constantly referring to himself in the third person. Jimmy likes Elaine. Jimmy can jump higher in his special basketball shoes. Using the third person was a humble way in antiquity to refer to yourself. It was an Aramaic idiom in the first century, and Jesus used it often. The third meaning refers to a divine figure we may refer to as the apocalyptic Son of Man. We find this figure in Daniel 7, the similitudes of Enoch, and 4th Ezra. In the interest of time, rather than reading the relevant portions of those texts, I'm going to summarize them by providing 8 characteristics of the apocalyptic Son of Man portrayed in them. Number 1, he will be a light to the Gentiles. 2, he will appear before God. 3, he will appear before all mankind on the clouds of heaven. 4, God will make him preside over judgment. 5, he will wipe away all evil. 6, he will rule over all. 7, he will sit on a glorious throne. 8, he will be worshipped and served as only God is. It seems quite clear to me that Jesus regards himself as the Son of Man in this sense in all 4 Gospels. However, let's focus on the earliest Gospel, Mark. On multiple occasions in Mark, Jesus tells his disciples that he, the Son of Man, is going to be betrayed, delivered to others, suffer, be killed, and raised from the dead. In Mark chapter 8, verses 31 through 38, Jesus says the Son of Man must suffer, then will come in his Father's glory with the holy angels. Some scholars have contended that Jesus was not here referring to himself as the Son of Man, but to someone else. However, there's no reason to regard Jesus' statement in verse 38 that the Son of Man will come in his Father's glory with the holy angels as referring to anyone other than Jesus, since he has just referred to himself as the Son of Man only 7 verses earlier. Moreover, 2 chapters later, in Mark 10:35 through 45, Jesus clearly speaks of himself when saying the Son of Man will suffer, then have a glorious throne. This, of course, is something said of the apocalyptic Son of Man. In Mark 13, Jesus speaks of coming on clouds with great power and glory and will send angels to gather the elect. In Mark 14, the high priest asks Jesus if he's the Messiah and Son of God. Jesus replies that he is and adds that they will see the Son of Man seated at God's right hand and coming on the clouds of heaven. At this, the high priest tears his clothes and accuses Jesus of blasphemy. Now, what was blasphemous about Jesus' statement? Certainly it wasn't blasphemous to claim to be the Messiah. Before and after Jesus, others had claimed to be the Messiah or Son of God. Simon of Perea, Judas of Galilee, Menachem ben Judah, Simon bar Kosaba had all claimed to be Messiah, and there was no charge of blasphemy. Moreover, prophets, priests, and kings had been called sons of God. It was Jesus' claim to be the Son of Man who will come to judge the world that elicited the charge of blasphemy. To paraphrase Jesus, he said to the Jewish leaders, "You're judging me now, but very shortly I'm going to be exalted by my Father, riding the clouds and sitting on his throne. One day my Father will make you a footstool for my feet, and you're going to honor me just as you honor my Father, because my Father and I, we're made of the same stuff. For the high priest, those were clothes-ripping words. Now, if Jesus was not referring to himself, they'd have no reason at all to charge him with blasphemy. Mark is not the only source to present Jesus as the apocalyptic Son of Man. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke also present Jesus in this manner in passages that are absent from Mark. On many occasions, the wording is so similar that it suggests they had a common source that has since been lost. Scholars have called this source Q. In the Q material, there are at least 3 texts that present Jesus as the apocalyptic Son of Man. In Q13, Jesus says he's the one who will decide who enters heaven on the day of judgment. In Q3, John the Baptist says he's unworthy even to untie Jesus' sandals as one of his servants. Jesus will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and fire. His pitchfork is in his hand, and he will clear his threshing floor and gather the wheat into this granary. But the chaff he will burn on a fire that can never be put out. In other words, Jesus will be the eschatological judge. In Q10, Jesus says, everything has been entrusted to me by my Father. Scholars have called this the Johannine thunderbolt because it sounds so much like Jesus in John chapter 3, verse 35, perhaps written 40 or more years later, where Jesus says, the Father loves the Son and has given all things into his hands. And while we're on John's Gospel, John very probably wrote after Mark, and most scholars regard him as an independent source. So it's interesting to observe that in the Gospel of John, Jesus regards himself as the apocalyptic Son of Man in chapters 5, 9, and 13. For example, in John 5, Jesus says, for not even the Father judges anyone, but he has given all judgment to the Son, so that all will honor the Son, even as they honor the Father. And he gave him authority to execute judgment because he is the Son of Man. So Jesus is presented as the apocalyptic Son of Man in the earliest Gospel, Mark, and in Q, and in John. Paul, who wrote prior to all of them, also regarded Jesus as the apocalyptic Son of Man. He does this clearly in 1 Thessalonians and 1 Corinthians. Now, since he's writing to Gentiles who wouldn't understand the Jewish apocalyptic Son of Man imagery, he doesn't call Jesus the Son of Man, but he paints the same portrait. Remember that in 1 Thessalonians, which is probably the earliest piece of New Testament literature, in this letter there are 5 references to the coming of Jesus. For example, in chapter 4, verses 15 and 16, Paul writes, for this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet of God. By saying this is the word of the Lord, Paul is probably referring to one of Jesus' teachings in reference to his return. Thus, Paul is providing a source independent to the Gospels pertaining to Jesus, teaching that he will descend from heaven with his holy ones, and with the shout of the archangel and the trumpet of God. So if there was any doubt remaining that in Mark, Jesus was referring to himself when he taught the Son of Man would return in glory, that Paul said this was Jesus' teaching in a letter written prior to any of the Gospels should settle the matter. The apocalyptic Son of Man is an enigmatic figure in the Jewish and biblical literature. It's the Son of Man who presides over the final judgment, who from his glorious throne will wipe away all evil, ruling over all who in turn will worship and serve him in a way that belongs only to the God who shares his glory with no one. According to Q4, Jesus recognized this when he told Satan, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. That particular word translated serve here appears just over 130 times in the Bible, with only one exception where Israel is said to serve her enemy. The term serve is always used to refer to an act done for a deity, such as prayer, fasting, and temple service. So Jesus recognized that this type of service is meant only for God. In Daniel 7, God hands over everything to this apocalyptic Son of Man so that all may serve him. Same word. There were many exalted figures in Second Temple Judaism. However, the Son of Man is unique in that he receives devotion that only God was to receive, such as sitting on God's throne and being worshipped. He was such an exalted figure that to claim to be him was to commit the crime of blasphemy and be worthy of death. That Jesus regarded himself as the Son of Man in this sense is multiply attested. It's in Mark, it's in Q, it's in John, and it's in Paul. I don't have time this evening, but I could also show Jesus claiming to be the apocalyptic Son of Man in the material unique to Matthew and the material unique to Luke. Thus, it's in every layer of the gospel tradition, from A to Z, and in Paul, who predates all of them. It's also in multiple literary forms: biography, sayings literature, and letter. Ladies and gentlemen, this is one of the very strongest forms of multiple attestation for which historians can ask. Therefore, although some ambiguity remains, the apocalyptic Son of Man figure appears to be God in some sense. That Jesus claimed to be this figure seems firmly established. With that said, let's see what else we can find in Mark. Remember that ancient biography focused on portraying the character of the person. So how else is Jesus portrayed in Mark? In Mark chapter 2, verse 10, Jesus heals a paralytic and tells him he forgives him of his sins. The Jewish leaders say, he's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? In Mark 2:28, Jesus allows his disciples to gather food on the Sabbath, which was not allowed by the Jewish law. When the Pharisees object, Jesus tells them he's Lord of the Sabbath. Now think about this. God instituted the 10 Commandments, which forbids work on the Sabbath. And so Jesus is doing some work on the Sabbath, and when the Pharisees object, Jesus says, chill out, guys, it's okay. I'm Lord of the Sabbath. Can you imagine what these guys might have been thinking? Who does this guy think he is? God? When it came to casting out demons in Mark chapter 3, Jesus claimed he had bound Satan and was now plundering his kingdom. But what man can bind Satan? In Mark chapter 9, Jesus' disciples had been unable to cast out a demon. Then Jesus comes along, says the word, and the demon is expelled. When his disciples later asked him why they were unable to cast out the demon, Jesus said that this sort of demon only comes out by prayer to God, and yet it came out merely by Jesus' word. He never had to pray. What does that say about Jesus' character? What about in Q? In Q 3:34, Jesus wished to gather his people under his wings. This recalls an early Jewish image in the Old Testament pseudepigrapha and the Mishnah, where God says he desires to shelter his people under his wings. In summary, the objective of ancient biography was to paint a portrait of the person by focusing on their teachings and deeds that illuminated their character. In every layer of the gospel tradition, and in Paul, who wrote earlier, Jesus believes himself to be the apocalyptic Son of Man. In Mark and Q, Jesus believes he possesses rights belonging exclusively to God. He forgives sins, is Lord of the 10 Commandments, binds Satan and plunders his kingdom, performs actions without prayer that can only be performed by others with prayer to God, and like God, desires to gather the Jewish nation under his wings. It should be of no surprise to us when John 5:18 later reports the response of others who wanted to kill Jesus because he was breaking the Sabbath and making himself equal with God. So contrary to claims of many, John doesn't give us an evolved Christology, but rather one more clearly stated upon further reflection. In conclusion, the thesis I'm defending is this. There are two key truths that render it more probable than not that Jesus claimed to be God in some sense. Key truth number one, the earliest known Christian generation, and one that was most plausibly connected to the apostles, regarded Jesus as God in some sense. Key truth number two, the best explanation for this view of Jesus is that he claimed to be God in some sense. This is why I regard it as being historically more probable than not that Jesus regarded himself as God in some sense. Of course, some of you may be thinking tonight's discussion may be an interesting academic exercise, but of little relevance to those of us living in the 21st century. I can only share why this interests me. For years, I've devoted myself to investigating the question of whether Jesus actually rose from the dead. The answer was important to me because I'm a conservative Christian, and if Jesus did not rise from the dead, then it seems to me at least that Christianity is a false religion. At least that's what the Apostle Paul wrote. He said, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't want to belong to a false religion. I got better things to do with my time. My passion is to discover and follow truth no matter where it leads. And after 6 years of intensely focused research resulting in a 700-page book, I became more convinced than ever that Jesus' bodily resurrection was an event that occurred in history. And if Jesus rose from the dead, it seems to me that much of what we read about Jesus in the Gospels becomes much more plausible. But who is this Jesus? Is he actually God in some sense, as orthodoxy asserts? I think a good historical case can be made that this is at least what Jesus thought. Whether you think Jesus was in fact God or was merely deluded will largely depend on whether you think Jesus was raised from the dead. And that's a topic for another evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next guest has flown all the way here from Yale. We're very happy to have him as well. I've got to know Dale in the last couple of days, and he's a pleasure to travel with, and he's a funny guy and a very smart guy, and I think you're going to learn a lot from him in the next few minutes. Dale is the Woolsey Professor of Religious Studies at Yale. He was educated at Abilene Christian University, Princeton Theological Seminary, and Yale University. His work explores the New Testament, Christian origins, the Greco-Roman world, the ancient family, and gender and sexuality in the ancient world. Professor Martin has been awarded fellowships by the National Endowment of the Humanities, the Fulbright Commission, the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, and the Lilly Foundation. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He was elected to this group in 2009. His publications, which a number of them are for sale on the back table, include Slavery as Salvation, The Corinthian Body, Inventing Superstition, Sex and the Signal Savior, and the Pedagogy of the Bible, as well as a New Testament introduction that, if Mike's 700-page book is a great door jam, this is a good one to prop up the piano. So, with all that said, we'd like to hear Dale Martin. Would you come up and give him a round Nova Scotian applause? Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Greg took us around to see some of your sites today in lovely Nova Scotia, and there's nothing on the Gulf Coast of Texas, where I'm from, that's like Peggy's Cove, believe me. So I very much enjoyed it. I also think this is a much better context to talk about this very, very complex issue of did Jesus think he was divine than a debate would be. In debates, you're constantly trying to make things black and white and get things on. And I think if anything about this topic, it's not black and white. For one thing, what it means in the ancient world to call a human being divine is very, very different from what it would mean in the modern world to call a human being divine. The divine Miss M, I guess, or divas, maybe, to be accepted. And so I think the discussion will be able to talk about what those three words that Mike kept saying, in some sense, because I think that's where the real worm bucket lies. But, what did it mean to be divine? So, I can't help but be reminded of the story of when God was trying to decide where to take his next vacation, and he was standing around the water cooler with some of his head angels, and Uriel said, "Oh, go to Saturn. You'll love Saturn. It's all the rings. It's really colorful." God said, "Too gaseous." Raphael said, "Try Mercury. You'd love it." Last year I took some friends to Mercury. We had a great time. God says, "Too dusty and dry." So then Michael chips in and says, "Go to Earth. You'll love it. The sand, the surf, it's beautiful. Took the wife and kids there last year. We all had a great time." God says, "Out of the question." 2,000 years ago, I took a vacation there, got a Jewish girl pregnant. They're still talking about it. What does it mean to be divine? A bit about myself. I grew up in a very fundamentalist church in Texas, but I am now an Episcopalian, an Anglican, in a very high Anglo-Catholic liturgical church in New Haven. Socially progressive on social issues, but very traditional liturgically. I get up every Sunday and say the Nicene Creed. When we have morning prayer, I say the Apostles' Creed. And sometimes we even say other creeds and confessions, all of which, of course, insist that Jesus is divine. I believe in the Trinity. I'm perfectly willing to confess that. So as a Christian, I believe in Jesus in those ways. I think it's an entirely different question to say, as a historian, as a practicing historian, what can I say about what Jesus thought about himself during his own lifetime? And that also means that, and let me say also that last night we were talking about resurrection and that sort of issue. I think that that's a much clearer issue that historians can come down on. I think, did Jesus think he was divine is a much more difficult question for even non-Christian historians to come to a decision about. So it's a muddy thing. But I also need to make the point that history is not the same thing as the past. It's also not the same thing as Jesus as he really was. History, in my view, is not the past or what happened. History is an account of the past that's constructed by modern professional historians using the regular tools of modern professional historiography. And I teach in my Historical Jesus class that there are, in my mind anyway, at least 3 Jesuses. And you'll see why I'm a postmodernist, and there's some ways that I don't think I could be a Christian if I weren't a postmodernist, because I need to be able to talk this way about reality and knowledge. The real Jesus is not the same thing as the historical Jesus. The real Jesus is also not the same thing as the Jesus who existed in the past. The real Jesus, in my view, as a Christian, is the second person of the Trinity, 100% human, 100% divine, the Jesus we worship in church. That's the real Jesus for me, the ultimate Jesus. Sounds like a rock band or something. Then there's the historical Jesus, which is that Jesus that professional historians construct. Notice I didn't say reconstruct. It's not like the Titanic. If the Titanic, we could get all the pieces of the Titanic off the ocean, haul them to land, and put those actual physical pieces back together, and then we've reconstructed the Titanic. That's not what historians do. Historians have never reconstructed anything in their lives. They construct it. And they construct it using whatever evidence they can find for historiography. That's the historical Jesus. It's a construction of modern historians. It's not the same thing as the real Jesus. But it's also not the same thing as the Jesus existed in the past. That Jesus, the human Jesus who existed in the past, is completely lost to us, as all the past is lost to us. The past does not exist anywhere. So we can't take our constructions to the past event, hold them next to it, and say, does it meet? What counts as a historical construction of Jesus is what professional historians will accept as a likely historical construction of Jesus. So, I think no responsible, non-apologetic Christian historian would claim that Jesus thought of himself as divine in anything like the Christian sense, that is, the second person of the Trinity, fully equal to Yahweh, as you put it. Fully divine as God the Father, in any way equal to God the Father, as one person of the Trinity, as the second person of the Trinity, in which the Holy Spirit is the third person, as not created but generated by God, etc. All those creedal statements, which I believe are true creedally, I don't think any responsible historian would say the historical Jesus considered himself any of those things. If the historical Jesus considered himself divine in any possible sense, it would not have been in the Orthodox Christian sense. That's my first point. But could the historical Jesus have considered himself divine in some kind of sense? Since there were many people who did claim divine status for themselves or other human beings they knew, it's not as unlikely as some apologists have claimed. As some people have said that, if Jesus didn't actually claim to be divine, then he was a liar or he was a lunatic if he was a human being who did this. I think, for example, Alexander the Great really believed himself to be divine in his lifetime. I think it's quite possible that some of the Roman emperors thought that they were divine also in some sense, and a fairly high sense. There may have been religious figures who claimed some kind of divine status for themselves. But do we have evidence that Jesus looked like these kinds of figures? And I don't think so. First, I think it is unlikely, simply from the beginning, in the first place, that Jesus thought he was divine for the following reasons. I assume that whatever Jesus was, he was a pious Jew, uneducated for the most part, and at home in rural and village settings. He was a Jewish peasant from Galilee. He may have seen himself as a prophet. If Jesus thought of himself as a Messiah in his present state, that is, not that he would become a Messiah later, but that he already was right then while he was walking around the Sea of Galilee, divine, that could have entailed some kind of divinity. Contrary to what some common opinion, even among many scholars, we do have Jewish texts from before and around Jesus' time that depict the Jewish king or a son of man or a Messiah figure as a son of God, as even begotten of God, and even addressed as God. So we have Jewish texts, not a lot, that talk about both the Son of God, begotten of God, God, and they use this for a Jewish king, a son of man, or a Messiah figure. All those things you find. Now, notice, this is not all in a neat package. Some texts have some of these things together, other texts have some of the others together, but it's at least possible. Certain psalms, later Greek translations of those psalms, a text or two from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and other Second Temple Jewish literature rarely, but do indeed depict a divine Messiah, though one certainly subordinate to God himself. And I'm taking a lot of this, I'm talking about Messiah figures and their divine status, from a fairly recent book from 2008 by my Yale colleagues Adela Yarbrough Collins and John Collins. It's called King and Messiah as Son of God, Divine, Human, and Angelic Messianic Figures in Biblical and Related Literature. I think it's the most thorough examination to date of all the different possibilities that there are in Second Temple Jewish literature of this period. It used to be said by people that calling someone a Messiah didn't make him divine. And for the most part, that's true. You can have a Messiah that doesn't have divine status. Most Messiahs, I think, in the ancient world were not thought by other Jews to have divine status. But we have a few texts that do. But the picture of Jesus we get from our best sources, which I take to be for his life, the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, don't seem to depict him as claiming that kind of royal messianic status for himself during his lifetime. And Collins also believe this. And I think because he was an illiterate Jewish peasant from rural and village Galilee, he would have appeared blasphemous and crazy to have made such claims during his lifetime, and I don't believe we have evidence that he did so besides his crucifixion. So even if he claimed messianic status for himself, it does not seem that he added divine status to it. In other words, I think it's more likely that Jesus may have thought of himself as a Messiah than that he thought himself as a divine Messiah. I think it would have been more